When you dare to share, you break the silence. When you dare to share, you speak your truth. When you dare to share, you use the full strength of your voice. When you dare to share, it brings opportunity to own your story. So tell it, be heard, and at the same time, your sharing is someone else's learning, inspiration, motivation, empowerment, and hope. There's always an element to each of our stories that remains a secret. For some, we feel it's a dirty little secret. Dare to share your untold story exposes these secrets in a welcoming and positive way. I encourage each of you out there to dare yourself to share what is yours to tell. When we dare, it is the courage to do something really important. Let this be a vow to each and every single one of us that we take risk, we brave, confront, and face what is, while inspiring and empowering all communities. So let's break that silence and tap into mental beauty. This is Salima Jadavji, your podcast host, a practicing social worker, and your mental wellness connoisseur. Welcome to the Dare to Share Your Untold Story podcast, episode number 94, Entrenched in Struggle and Vulnerability, a Victim's Journey Through Narcissism. To all my fellow listeners, before we get started, I'm just dropping in a note to give you a heads up that this podcast might be emotionally triggering for you. We do invite guests onto the show who share openly about extremely difficult life moments with exposure and impact of what the struggles have been like. The intensity of each episode could have a variable impact on your emotional and mental well-being based on your own personal story. If at any point the topic becomes uncomfortable or upsetting to you in any way, please do not pressure yourself to listen. Instead, be kind to yourself, do some self-care, and perhaps give another episode a try. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our courageous and daring guest, Phoenix Gould. Phoenix is a certified professional coach who specializes in healing narcissistic-induced trauma. She is passionate about creating experiences for her clients which make healing easy and delightful. Her clients emerge from these encounters forever changed. Phoenix has also spent 30 years exploring different healing methods and now has a selected number of modalities which she finds the most powerful to use to assist her clients to thrive in their healing journey. In her free time, Phoenix loves to travel the world, even though she questions her own navigation abilities. She will never say no to dancing the tango argentino, nor any other form of dance. She lives with her husband and 2 children in a remote location in Canada. Well, hello, Phoenix. Welcome to the Dare to Share Your Untold Story podcast.
Thank you so much, Salima. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. I'm really delighted to have you as a guest on the show today, and I'm grateful for your willingness to be here today to tell your story. You know, I'd like to say that I'm truly humbled to encounter guests like yourself who allow me to tap into their vulnerabilities and draw on their strength and insight and inspiration that gets shared into this space. It's incredibly important that we take a stance together to help break barriers of mental stigma. So thank you for being here.
You're so welcome. Thank you so much for giving me the chance to talk about this.
Awesome. Yeah, for sure. And you know, Phoenix, in case you're still wondering, this podcast, it's all about bringing forward untold stories that people go through, whether directly about a mental health struggle or something else. And we know that no matter what the story, there is impact on one's own mental health in some way, which remains tucked away. And so this platform, it serves in a way to break the barriers of mental stigma that have been conditioned in our society. So today, together, my hopeful mission is that it's really for both of us to encourage people to share and tell what individuals typically have reservation to express. And of course, I continue to bring forward a trend, and it's called the mental beauty rethink. So Phoenix, what immediately comes to mind when you hear the phrase, the mental beauty rethink?
Well, what comes to mind is that so often we're told that, a mentally beautiful person has it all got together. They know where they're going. They're handling life beautifully. And the rethink kind of questions that might be the only beauty possible.
Interesting. I really enjoy asking this question to people because I always find there's a richness in the responses. Your take is a very interesting one. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's embark on unraveling your story, Phoenix. I'm so ready to dive in.
All right.
All right. So for our first question, Phoenix, give us the newspaper headline of how you would title your untold story. How would it read?
It would read From Darkness to Light.
Say it again, please.
Yes, From Darkness to Light.
From darkness to light.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. There's obviously meaning that this title has for you. Where does it come from? What does it mean to you?
It comes from the experience of just feeling like I was in darkness after growing up with my narcissistic mother. I was so lost within myself. I had no clue who I was. So there's that darkness around. I didn't even know who I was. There was no light to tell me what I liked, what I wanted. So there is that slow getting to know myself in my story, which, shed light on who I was, but also what I was struggling with and why. So I would say that's the first layer. But there's another one as well, and that would be the darkness of, struggling inside, a psyche with who am I? Who do I need to be? Who do I want to be? Can I be who I want to be? I'm not lovable. I am, I'm not measuring up to feeling that, oh my God, yes, I am lovable. I do measure up. I do know what I want and I can go for it and I can live this life in beauty.
It sounds like an incredible journey that you have been through. And so, I appreciate you sharing the depth of where this title comes from. And, this is a great segue to uncovering this untold story of yours. So without further ado, tell us what your untold story is all about. Like, let us know. What's that snapshot?
So I grew up in East Germany when I was still communist in 1972. And I grew up with a narcissistic mother and an enabling father. Lived a life that was very, very difficult, of always feeling that I was not enough and that I had to be or act a certain way to be loved, conditional love. And so that combined with living in East Germany was really tough because East Germany was also very regimented and dictatorial. And there were many rules I had to adhere to. And then we moved to West Germany. And when I was 21, I moved to New York City. I wanted to become a dancer. I had danced my whole life. I started dancing when I was 3 years old. And I think that actually saved me because there was a way where I could feel myself and express myself through dance. And, no one could tell me to feel or express myself otherwise. I think that created like a little safe place for me that kept my soul sane. And so when I was 21, I decided to go to New York City. And
did this by yourself? No one came with you? This was something you were doing independently?
Well, I had a friend who I had gone to dancing school with in Germany. Okay. And she also wanted to go to New York City. So it was the two of us who ventured out. And it was in New York City when I felt like my roots were ripped out. It was really tough. I think I went through a depression phase actually when I was there for the first 3 months because it was really hard to get out of bed. And I was scared to my bones, not knowing the language, not knowing the culture. And I was feeling completely lost. And I think it was that feeling of my roots being ripped out that made me so vulnerable that I encountered probably all of my dark side or all of my difficulties kind of stood out right away.
Right.
I had a really hard time being in social situations where I was so self-conscious that it literally seemed to me at times as if I was leaving my own body and observing the scene from above. Like I didn't know what to say, how to say it, whether I should say it. I was also in a romantic relationship that was incredibly hard because I felt so unlovable. And I thought, oh my God, if this guy ever finds out how I feel on the inside, he will run away and abandon me. And so I was constantly busy trying to hide the struggle I was going through.
Okay. And this all happened in New York?
That all happened in New York, yes.
Okay.
I was there for 2 years. And during that time, I met a coach, or rather a psychologist, who was also First Nations and was trained by his elders as a shaman. And he took me on when I described to him what I was struggling with. And he was the first person in my life who I felt I could share how I was feeling and what I was going through honestly. And so he was with me for many, many years, over 20 years. In the beginning, very intensely, every week I did therapy with him. And that's when I started to uncover, why I was having these problems and starting to unravel my story.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious about before that time, like before you got to New York,
Mm-hmm.
how did you cope? It sounds like it was a very intense atmosphere for you to be in with a mother who was narcissistic, as you say, and a father who was enabling. How did you manage all that time?
Mm-hmm. Well, I felt that I became incredibly careful and I became a super sensor. So to stay safe, because my mom would burst into these rages, I would sense her all the time. I had to know what mood she was in, what she wanted, what she needed, and then give it to her so I wouldn't have to suffer her rages.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't. And so there would be this blow up with me where I remember feeling like I haven't done nothing wrong. I don't understand, why you're so mad at me. And I remember even saying that, like I did nothing wrong. I did nothing wrong. But that would make her so mad that she would grab me and pull down my pants and beat me and then send me to my room to be ashamed of myself and to only come out once I knew what I had done wrong.
So you even endured like physical punishment.
Yes, I did.
Wow. And what was that shame like for you to experience? How old were you?
Oof. 7 comes to me as a number.
Okay.
It went on for several years. I'm not quite sure when it started and when it ended, but at 7, definitely.
And at 7, you're being spanked right on your bare skin, and you're feeling shamed, and you're sent to your room. What kinds of stuff were you thinking about, or contemplating, or entertaining in your mind?
Well, I was devastated. I don't think I would have even had words to describe what I was feeling. But
Mhm.
the shame, there was shame for sure, because who would be treated like this? Also, I felt incredibly naked, literally. And I remember feeling that I wish I would die because maybe then she would be sorry. So there must have been, you know, I was hopeless in that moment. And I remember it being so painful that I went to a space which I now, recognize as dissociation,
Mm.
where I would almost stop breathing and where I felt as heavy as lead and I wouldn't move. And that would be the only space I had to rest. Because if I came out of it, I would be feeling shame and indignation and anger and sadness. And I would feel so abandoned that was the only space I had to feel okay.
Right. And when you were trying to do all the right things and work your mom's code, right? Work your mother's code,
Hmm.
like what is she going to do? How is she going to do it? What do I need to do? What can I prevent? How do I make sure I appease her? All of these things that you were contending with. You mentioned your father was an enabler. So was he around when all these things were going on?
Yes, at times he would be there. And I really don't know, about the specific memory I have, whether it's real or imagined, but I remember being spanked and him sitting in the living room reading a paper. I'm not sure if this is real, but I would just think, why is he not saving me? Why is he not coming to save me? Why is he not coming?
Did you ever like scream for your dad or ask him to come save you?
No, I didn't. I didn't. That didn't even occur to me.
Right. You did entertain this thought of like, well, why isn't he coming? Why isn't he stopping this from happening?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes.
And then as you asked these questions, did you give yourself your own answers? Like, did you start making up narratives?
Yes, yes, I did. I think that likely for some of them, he probably wasn't there.
Hmm.
And when he was there, he didn't know what to do. He was probably as frozen as I was in that situation.
Hmm.
And maybe he had even tried to interfere. I don't have no memory of this,
Hmm.
but the wrath upon him would have been tremendous. And it might not have changed what happened to me. It might have just made her more angry and beat me up more. I don't know.
Well, it sounds like this is like a reflection that you've had afterwards, but I'm just curious
Yes.
about when you were that young child and you're wondering, like, where is my dad? Why isn't he coming? I know he's there. He's reading the paper. Did you ever end up having like self-shaming thoughts because of that? To say, like, even he doesn't love me, or like anything that kind of alluded to
Mm-hmm.
like the feeling of shame and sadness and abandonment to like increase? Like, I'm just curious,
Mm.
any stories you were telling yourself?
Right. At the time, I don't think so.
Okay.
Because, the memory I'm telling you about is one that came much later, and I don't even know if it's real. If I think back to the time, I was just so focused on my mom that my dad wasn't even in the picture, which is another thing that narcissists do, right? They catch so much of our attention that the other parent literally kind of disappears in the background.
Okay.
So when my mom had my attention, she had my full attention because I needed to do everything I could to stop what was going on. So in those moments, I don't I don't remember thinking about my dad. I just tried to figure out how the hell can I make this stop.
Right. So your thoughts only went as far as how come he's not coming to help me? How come he's not saving me?
Hmm.
Beyond that, you didn't have anything else that crossed your mind. Your focus really was on your mom.
Yes, and I knew that my dad loved me.
Okay.
I knew that. Hmm.
And how did you know that? You had a strong sense because he showed it in a particular way?
Yes, so many ways. He was a teacher and I was in kindergarten, and he would pick me up every day as soon as he could. The other kids still had to stay, but he picked me up early. And on the way home, there was never any rush. There were these little walls that I would balance on forever, and he'd hold my hand or just watch me play in the playground that was nearby. He never ever rushed me, and I could always be with him who I was.
So he was a very hands-on father, and you were feeling like you could be free-spirited around him.
Yes, I never had to do the same thing as with my mom. I could just be me. And he just watched me, and I could somehow feel that love while he was watching me and driving me to dance lessons and driving me anywhere I wanted to be driven, and even organizing the dance classes for me and
Hmm.
taking me to school. And I could sit there and watch him teach. Yeah, there was a lot of attention that was really kind
Hmm.
and really loving and just letting me be, which, at that time was the greatest gift, really.
Yeah. And I can see how conflicted and torn you would be when you're receiving all the punitive measures from your mom and then knowing your father is home and saying, I wonder what he's doing. Like, why isn't he coming? Like, that must have been so painful for you.
Yeah, that's the thing. I don't remember much. It's just that one moment that I remember. That memory was really hard.
Yeah, yeah. Of course it would be. It sounds very painful, especially with the relationship that you just described of
Hmm.
between you and your father, and the love that was very bold and clear, and you feeling safe and free spirited. I mean, it speaks volumes to how your relationship was.
Hmm.
Okay, and so that was some examples of what you endured when you were that young. And then as you became a teenager and you grew up a bit more, did it change at all in terms of how you were treated, or what your mother did or didn't do, or what codes that you had to continue reading, or as you got more autonomy, were you able to respond differently?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, she stopped beating me at some point, so I wasn't beat anymore when I was a teenager. I still had to be really careful, what I say and how I say it. So I would still sense into her the same way. But I got to be more independent and be more with my friends, which made it easier because I wasn't home as much. Something else changed also was that my dad started defending me.
Oh.
Yeah. There were moments where, she would say something and, I'd respond, she'd get mad, and then he would jump in and say, well, that's not what she meant. This is not what Phoenix was trying to say.
Hmm.
But then whenever my dad came to my rescue, she would go super mad. And then it was sure there would be an outburst, which I was trying to
Hmm.
avoid. So I remember telling him at some point, I really appreciate you trying to help me, but really, it just makes it worse
Hmm.
in the end, for both of us. So, let me handle it. I think that through the time of trial and error, I became really good at keeping my mom supplied with, the attention and fuel that she wanted.
Hmm.
When I was around her, I never ever slipped into just being myself. I would always check in. I'd always keep an eye on her. So the way I see it when I think about it now is that, I would have one eye on the activity I was doing and the other was always on her. And I could sense the slightest shift. And I became really, really a master at stopping whatever I was doing and jumping in and saying the right thing to make it all right again.
Wow. You had to learn so much code.
Yeah.
You
Yes.
really had to learn how to smooth things over. You became a master at it, as you said, just by observing and witnessing and just executing accordingly. Okay. And so tell me more about the pain. Like, how are you affected having gone through this? So you mentioned some things like, fearing abandonment and relationships being affected. Tell me more about that.
Hmm. Well, I somehow believed, I learned to believe that in order to be loved, I had to be what the other person wanted me to be, and I had to work really hard. And that translated into relationships. And so
Hmm.
whenever I liked someone, I wasn't, the work would never stop. I
Right.
didn't feel that I was loved for me because actually inside I felt kind of unlovable, but didn't know that consciously. So whenever I met with someone who I liked or I engaged in a relationship, my automatic response would be tuning into them at every single moment. What do they want? How do I have to behave? What is it they like? What should I say? What should I not say? And so in the end, they always loved the version that I presented, but who I was not. And
Hmm.
so in the end, I never felt really truly loved because they loved whatever I presented, but not who I truly was.
Right. So not your authentic self, but
Hmm.
the script of what you thought you had to be.
Yes, exactly. Almost like, the mask that the narcissist has for different reasons. But,
Mhm.
I always wore a mask and I was always afraid to be discovered of what was underneath that mask. And while I was doing that and while that was the only thing I knew how to do, it also felt incredibly wrong.
Right.
Part of me knew that wasn't the way to go, but I had no courage at all to present, who I was because all I knew about me was a wreck of insecurity and self doubt and feeling worthless. And so, wow, could I ever expose that to someone who I wanted to be with me so desperately?
Yeah.
And also because, of course, I was craving love, right?
Right.
And attention. I didn't get it from my mom. My dad wasn't allowed to give it to me
Right.
openly because my mom would have punished him and would have punished me, which is probably why his love always showed in actions, driving me places, being really quiet, observing me, but he would never be allowed to actually express his love or say that he loved me.
Right.
I had a big, huge hole inside of me.
You were yearning for it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, one with the partners, I couldn't really get it because in the end I felt they didn't love me. They just loved that mask I put on. And also I ended up in a lot of relationships that were more like one night stands. And even with people who I really didn't want to be intimate with, but a part of me yearned so much for attention and love that it feels like I went for scraps. Whatever scraps of love I could get, I would get. And if that meant sleeping with someone, then I would.
Right. And so that's the meaning that you created from all of this. And I'm so curious, that's such a difficult and complicated journey that you've been on and worked through. When you talk about the insecurity and the self-doubt and the really feeling the unworthiness, did those themes show up in other parts of your life as well?
No, actually, and that's the curious thing, because at the same time, I was a dancer, dancing in New York City and being confident about my dancing, being totally fine to be seen on stage. And there was no shyness there at all. But really, it was in interpersonal relationships and usually with people who I wanted the approval of. People who I didn't care so much about, I could kind of be myself with. But as soon as I either admired someone or I fell in love with them or I got a crush, that's when everything shifted to a completely different mode of, okay, now I've got to be someone else.
But as a dancer, I think what you're saying is I was being myself. There was a way for me to give myself permission to be myself.
Yes, there was. I think that was that little pocket of grace I got,
Because no one will really know because I'm performing, I'm on stage. So it's safe to be myself.
That's right. If I had to say words or do theater and be an actor, it would have been an entirely different thing. But because I could speak through my body and I felt really at home in my body, that was easy.
Right. Well, was there any other place that it was easy for you? Or was it just the dancing?
Well, with really good friends, with friends who I confided in and who loved me in spite of who I was or because of who I was, I could share who I was. So I've had a few really wonderful friendships with women who kind of felt more like they'd be my sisters.
Okay.
And to them, I could definitely open up. And, there was a lot of love there, which was also really special for me.
Yeah, and it sounds like you really were able to be vulnerable and authentic with these friends. Okay. And so, did you notice that gradually you were able to experience your authenticity more and more? Or do you feel like there were only these certain pockets that it would be in?
Before I started working with my guide, psychologist, there were only these pockets. But as soon as I started working with him, I could start to feel changes, after a while. So over time, I learned to be myself with others and then to be fiercely myself. At first I would be tentatively be myself and
Calling
see.
it out.
Yeah. And I would become more and more courageous over time. And now I'm a warrior, It's like, you dare me to be myself? Yes, of course. Here I am.
I love
Take me or
it.
leave me. But
I love it. I'm just going to try it out, being myself and see what that looks like. And then I'm going to fiercely show up this way. Like, that's what I'm going to do now. And you know what? I'm a warrior. I'm a champ. I really like how you describe this process of going at it. And each time you went for it with a bit more ammunition.
yes, exactly. And I think it got to the point now where I really love those challenges. I mean, nothing makes me feel more alive than when there's a really, really, really big challenge. to be vulnerable in a certain way.
Yeah,
And yeah, it's the most scary thing for me also,
of course.
but also the part that makes me feel alive the most.
Sure. Now, were there any other obstacles that you encountered along the way? I mean, you've described so much about enduring the difficulties with your mom, how, she treated you and what that whole relationship was like. And then also the themes and how you were impacted from that and how that showed up in other parts of your life. Aside from, I know you mentioned the interpersonal relationships was a big area, but I'm just wondering if there were other obstacles that you hurdled through that showed up, because you had been impacted in so many ways.
Well, I think the obstacles have been there constantly, because as soon as I solved one, another one, that makes room for another one to present itself, so you can work through that. So really, in that sense, the obstacles have never stopped.
Can you give an example of what an obstacle might have been?
Yeah, sure. I have to say that even though I knew how much I suffered with my mom, I didn't know that she was a narcissist until about 6-7 years ago. And so my whole life, I tried to understand, what was wrong with her. And that is the only unfortunate part, that even with the psychologists that I have worked with, it never clicked for them that she might be a narcissist. They always talked about borderline personality disorder or bipolar because of the patterns. And so, there were times when I felt actually really bad for my mom because I could see that she was struggling. And so rather than distancing myself, which I should have done, I tried to help her. We know that doesn't work with a
Right.
narcissist. We can't help them in that way. But for many years, I actually gave up even more of myself in order to help her and be there for her and support her. And so I did all the wrong things, involved myself even more in her life and got intertwined and dependent with her even more.
Sure.
And so, there were struggles of her calling me in the middle of the night when I had moved away and saying she didn't want to live anymore, and me trying to talk her out of suicide and being worried sick and all these things. And so, it was a struggle for me to realize that I had to let that go, that the helping didn't work.
Mm.
And that really, really, really only clicked once I realized that she was a narcissist.
Right. So that's like a big struggle with relationship boundaries, right?
Yes.
And it sounds like that theme of even when it's not enough, you keep giving more. That seems to be like a pattern that showed up in all kinds of interpersonal relationships.
Yes, very much. I had no idea.
And you had no idea what was the driving force. So I'm curious, how did you, when you said it was about 5 or 6 years ago, it dawned on you, what is it that clicked? Like, what was that moment of, aha, this is what's been going on?
Well, I had been, buying books about borderline personality disorder because that came closest to how she was acting, and I was studying it for years.
You were really invested.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And, how do you help someone? How are you in a relationship with a borderline personality disorder person? And a friend of mine went through a terrible relationship, and she came across narcissism when she tried to figure out what was wrong with her partner. And she said, Phoenix, you should look into narcissism. And I said, I don't think so, but yeah, send me some material. And I read through it, and as I was reading it, it was just light bulbs going on everywhere.
Mm.
She's like, what? Oh my God, that is exactly, these are the same words she says. That's what she always does. And so narcissism kind of filled in all the gaps that didn't quite work for the idea of a borderline personality disorder. It filled in every single gap. And it was like, oh my God.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was 7 years ago. And then I studied, narcissism. I read every book I could get my hands on. I listened to every podcast. Like, I really needed to understand it.
So that's when you had your oh my goodness moment, when your friend shared that book with you and what the book had, and you looked at it yourself, and it was like a ticky box, like one after the other.
Yes.
Like, oh my goodness. And that must have been, did you feel like a little bit of relief after?
Oh, totally.
Because it finally made sense to you?
Totally. As you're saying, finally everything made sense. Before, nothing made sense. And once I studied narcissism, everything she did made sense. And it was such a relief to finally understand, because with a narcissistic parent or a person, we're always wondering, why do they say that? Why can't I convince them? Why do they think that? Why do they do that?
Like, what else do I need to do? What could I do differently? Like, you're always trying to correct yourself.
Exactly.
But you don't need to, or you didn't need to, and you didn't know that.
Right. I could finally stop trying,
Right. Wow. Holy moly. That must have been such a moment for you when it all clicked and came together and made sense.
It was, but it now presented a completely different issue. Like, now what?
Right. So then now what? Right.
Now what?
I've been going through this all in a different angle. So now what do I do?
And I had kids at the time, and this presented the next challenge, right? I wanted my kids to have a relationship with my parents, when I still thought she was a borderline personality disorder. And with my dad, of course, whom I loved. I was living in Canada at the time. I went with them to Germany once or twice a year to be with my parents. And when they were still little, my mother would be very sweet and love bomb them and just be super, super sweet. But as soon as they started to have their little own personality, that's when the trouble started.
Right. So when the disagreement, when there was misalignment, like you're not showing up the way I want you to show up.
Exactly.
You could start seeing the changes in your mother and her behavior.
And now I could see that she was treating them the same way that she treated me. And of course, I could not let that happen, right? So now I had to stand up for my kids, which caused a hell of a lot of conflict.
Finally stood up to your mother.
I did. I did for my kids what I couldn't do for myself.
And what was that like?
It felt really good on the one hand, because I was protecting my children. I was not enabling her. And at the same time, it created more problems for my dad, which now had to endure more rages from my mom, because with a narcissist, if you don't get what you want from one person, you will look for that in the other, right? And so I could see my dad suffer more. Also, I could see my kids actually suffer. Despite my trying to protect them, I could actually not protect them fully, because they would still see her raging. They would still see her getting upset about something they had done, and they couldn't help feel guilty, no matter how often I told them that it wasn't their fault. So here was the new dilemma of, wow, I don't think I can allow my mother to see my children ever again. That was a huge conflict, because I didn't want...
That's not the way you wanted it to be. That's not the way you envisioned your life and your children growing up. You envisioned that they would have contact and have a bond.
Yes. And I knew, of course, how she would react, and that would completely destroy any relationship that her and I could ever have. And it would very harshly impact, the contact and connection that I would have with my father. So, at the time I wasn't aware that I would lose my father. That was a shock that came a little later. And I didn't think at all that I would lose my brother, which was another shock. And so, there was that challenge. Once I realized that I could not ever do this to my kids again, which meant I would have to tell my mom that they were never coming again, or, we would never come again. And that I would have some kind of an explanation of why. It took me, I think, 5 months to make that decision, because even though she is who she is, there was what felt like love, how could you not love your mom?
Of course.
No matter who your mom is. And there was tremendous love for my dad. And I didn't want to hurt her. And I didn't want to hurt my dad. And I know it would. If I said, you never get to see the kids again, I knew exactly the impact that would have on them, because they were old. And that was the one thing that really lit them up. And I didn't want to hurt my mom. And so for 5 months, I went round and round in my head, toiling with this incredibly difficult decision. I don't want to hurt them like this. I can't do that. Wow, what a painful thing for them to have to endure.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
then, trying to find different ways. Could I do this? Could I do that to protect my kids? Maybe I could try this. And then always coming to the same conclusion. There is nothing, I will never be able to completely protect them in her presence.
Knowing what you know about her, and
Yeah.
because you can't control her behavior, there are things you don't have control over. And that seemed like it was too big of a risk.
Yes. And I knew that I had to put my children and wanted to put my children before anyone.
Right.
And so, after 5 months, I made that decision. And that, of course, starts a whole new story around, what the narcissist will do when they're being disconnected.
Oh yeah, it's a whole other like unraveling, right? Of what that must have been like for you.
Mhm.
And Phoenix, I'm actually really curious. When people come to see me for therapy, individuals are typically in one of three places when they come. Some are getting started on their journey, trying to figure out what they want to work on, or know that they've experienced some really tough moments in life and they want to unpack it. Some are in the middle. Perhaps there's something that they're experiencing in the present moment and it's triggered some of their past. And some people are looking back where they want to move forward in their life. They want to close chapters from the past or get some closure or get some new insight, do some personal growth so they can move forward. So, what part of the journey would you say that you are in at this time? Would you say that you're getting started, in the middle, or would you say that you're looking back?
Well, interestingly enough, I'm in two places at the same time. I'm looking back, I've been moving forward with my life for quite a number of years now, but there every so often are new little pockets that surface where I'm going like, ooh, wow, I've never looked at this, that I've never thought of.
Right. And I guess that's part of the healing journey, right? Is the more that
Yeah,
you're able to unravel, the deeper you're able to see. So it almost sounds like what you're saying is that you're looking back for the most part, but maybe you're like in the in between phase where it's like in the middle, but looking back, but really close to the looking back where you're fully looking back.
I think there's so many layers of when we've had a traumatic childhood, there's so many layers that will not surface until other layers are moved out of the way. So while I feel super happy with my life, I am incredibly positive. I love where I am. I'm also really curious about every single layer that comes up, and I'm like, ooh, there's another thing I could hear that has never surfaced.
Hmm. But like where you are in this timeline, like you can still be looking back and connecting to things you haven't connected with before. Because it sounds like you have a lot of tools in your tool belt now that even when things come up, you have the ability to be curious about it and work through it.
I feel full. I feel whole. I feel really satisfied with where I am, which would put me into the later phase that you describe. And yet, yeah, maybe I'm in between.
Hmm. Okay. So we've talked about a lot of different things that you have been impacted with, a lot of different themes that you were contending with, lots of different emotions that you experienced. And I'm just curious if you can share a little bit more about how your untold story has affected your mental health. I know you talked about even when you got to New York, your mood was a bit on the low side. You had a hard time for the first 3 months, but prior to New York, there was so many other things that you contended with and so many emotions and fear of abandonment and the loneliness and the unworthiness and feeling unlovable. Can you speak a little bit more about how your mental health specifically was impacted?
Well, I think I was always struggling, really. I mean, how can one not, right? But I wasn't aware of it because it was so normal to me. So I don't think I even knew what normal would have been back then.
Hmm. Hmm.
Personal relationships were always somehow difficult. I always doubted myself. I always thought that what I said was more stupid and less important than what other people said. I certainly wasn't very daring. And I also was very, very young inside. I feel that, whereas I could see my school friends through their teenager years grow and start to express themselves in different ways and kind of experiment with lots of things. By the time they were 16, they kind of seemed to know a lot more about them. I always felt like I was 12. Even when I was 17, 18, 19, I always felt like I was still 12 in some ways. And that caused a lot of shame. So I think I carried shame with me wherever I went. That was just a part of me feeling ashamed of who I was and feeling like I can't keep up. They're in a different place than me, and I didn't know how to make it there. But I felt wrong about being where I was. And so, there was a constant questioning myself, never trusting myself and my thoughts and my feelings. I never experienced depression in that sense. And I think that was because I was very busy with dancing, thank goodness. I danced my whole life.
Dancing was
Yeah.
your savior, your blessing in disguise.
Yes, because I got into it more and more as I grew up. Soon I was in a dance group, and then I was in two dance group, and then I started competing in social dancing. So I was busy. And when my youngest was 4, I decided to teach dance because where I lived at the time, there was no dance, and I really wanted him to experience it, just to get into his body and feel really comfortable in his body. So for some years he did that. The story of dance took me to become a professional dancer. From New York, I moved to Canada to be a professional modern dancer for many years. So it really went where I wanted it to go.
Oh, that's why dancing is so
Mm-hmm.
important for you, and why you're always able to connect to dance.
Mm-hmm.
All right. That's awesome. So, what's your key message to the listeners of our show? What is really important for you to share with the audience, Phoenix?
Healing can happen. If I would have known back then where I would be right now, I would have not believed it. So I'm quite astonished at how far I was able to go, that I could feel the way I feel right now. So healing is possible. And whereas, a lot of us fear that path because we're so afraid that the darkness will show up and we won't know how to handle it, it's actually not as scary as we think. And it can be incredibly delightful and wonderful. We can fall in love with who we are, which is, wow. I mean, that's amazing.
Mm-hmm. I love the message of fall in love with who you are. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any other message that you think is important for the audience to know?
Yes, that you're not alone.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone tries to hide it so well and is very successful. So it's actually, that is one of the isolating factors, which is what is so amazing about your show, that you let people speak about it. If I would have known that other people struggle the way I do, I would have felt so much better.
Mm-hmm.
And I would have probably known much faster where to look for help and start my healing journey even earlier,
Right.
But I had no idea. And that isolation creates even more shame.
Right. Yeah, it feeds into it.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Okay. These are really important messages. Really important messages. All right. So, Phoenix, I'm curious about what's been game changing for you in terms of inspiration, something that's really close to you that reflects your untold story. Like, is there an inspirational quote or book or event or something that really spoke volumes to you or speaks volumes to you now that has been really pivotal for you?
Yes, I think that the biggest change inside that healing journey is when we can start to love ourselves. Of course, how the hell do you do that? But there is this quote from David White that I really, really love. And it goes like this. We have to learn to love those parts of ourselves that limp.
Can you say it again?
Yes. We need to learn to love those parts of ourselves that limp. Because so many of us, I know that now because my clients are going through the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
We believe that we have to become perfect to be lovable.
Right.
And that throws us even more into the pattern of trying to impress, trying to be this, trying to be that. Yeah. But if we can only stop that for a moment and get some tools, some guidance in how to practice self-love, that changes everything. I mean, that's the biggest turnaround right there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's a very moving quote. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm. And here's another thought, maybe, because I think at some point we have to make that choice. Will we work to become perfect? Are we going to strive to become perfect? And I can tell you, as you know very well, that's never going to happen because
perfectionism is not attainable, actually, right?
Exactly. So are we going to strive to be perfect, or are we going to strive to be whole?
Right.
And once I could understand that perfection really wasn't an option, I turned my efforts to being whole, and that means embracing all the parts inside of ourselves, which is exactly what David White is meaning by this, learning to love the parts that limp, the ones that are not graceful and pretty and wonderful.
That's great. That's amazing. So what is a cause or an organization that's been impactful to you on your journey that you'd like to give a shout out to?
Well, really my coach has been pivotal. There hasn't been an organization. There hasn't been like a specific book because each one contributes just a tiny little part. But if it wasn't for my coach, who's unfortunately no longer practicing, so I wouldn't be where I am today. So with a tremendous amount of love, my shout out would go to him, Don Runflow. Mm-hmm.
That's wonderful. Okay. And how can people connect with you if they would like to? Where are you findable?
Mm-hmm. I have a Facebook group and I have a Facebook page. Mm-hmm. They can reach me through email and WhatsApp and also Instagram.
Okay, perfect. Well, we've grabbed all that information from you, so it will be available on your show notes page. So people just have to click on your name and everything will be right there, ready for them to take in and connect with you if they need to or would like to.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So, Phoenix, guess what?
What?
You just dared yourself to share. Congratulations.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. It's been such a pleasure.
Oh my goodness, Phoenix, I would just like to take a moment to express my gratitude for the deep story shared in this space today. Your ability to share with vulnerability and grace all that you have experienced as part of your upbringing, how you were affected, the emotional pain you endured, all of the internal chatter that you contended with, and how to find your way through it all. Your story is a remarkable one to share and to be heard. So I'm truly grateful to have been able to hear and witness your story today. So thank you for the deep conversation and for all the daring and sharing. You rock.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciated all your questions.
Awesome. And once again, Phoenix, thank you for being part of Dare to Share Your Untold Story and helping to be a voice in breaking down the barriers of mental stigma. To all of our listeners, if you like what you've been hearing on this podcast and you want to be part of breaking down barriers of mental stigma, I invite you to go wherever you are listening to the episode and hit subscribe. Leave us a comment or a review of the episode and maybe how you relate to it. To learn more about what we offer, visit www.daretoheal.co. And if you are feeling ready and brave to share, please submit your story by visiting www.daretoshare.co. Thanks for joining in.